Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. We have former Army JAG Margaret Donovan with us today. We'll chat with her in just a moment. But first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow or subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So Margaret Donovan is a visiting clinical lecturer in law at Yale Law School and an attorney with Koskoff Koskoff Bieder. She is a former assistant United States attorney for the District of Connecticut. She also served 6 years in the United States Army and was a captain in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, more commonly known as JAGS. Margaret, welcome into the back room.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So for listeners who may only know the term from TV news reports, what exactly is a JAG officer and what are their key responsibilities?
So a JAG officer is a member of the Judge Advocate General's Corps, and it is basically Army lawyers, or military lawyers, I should say. I was in the Army, and so I'm going to tell you from an Army perspective what we did. But in the military, you have war fighters. So you have people who are in the infantry, logistical support, artillery, air defense. But you have this sort of slew of support staff in any military unit, including doctors, HR people, finance people, and of course, lawyers. So the Judge Advocate General Corps is comprised of military lawyers, and they get assigned to units. So as a JAG officer, you could be assigned to an infantry unit, you could be assigned to working in a courtroom, or you could be assigned to really any level of command within the military, and your role is to advise commanders and, in some cases, advise soldiers and assist with the legal process in the military.
And using as an example what's been happening with troop deployments on U.S. streets, suspected Venezuelan drug boat bombings, restrikes, which killed 2 shipwrecked survivors, seizing oil tankers, can you walk us through how the oversight from JAGS may have changed the course of those decisions and actions?
Well, that's a variety of different topics. And so the judge advocate's role in each of those topics, in each of those sort of areas would be a little bit different. But from a bird's eye view of what is happening to the military and the degradation of the value that the military places on acting lawfully, that is a result of the current leadership, in my opinion, of Secretary Hegseth saying, from even before he took the position of Secretary of Defense, he wrote a book, he's spoken quite publicly, that he does not think highly of lawyers who are trying to tell him what the right way to do things is. So from the beginning, he fired a number of high-ranking judge advocates. Basically, in the Judge Advocate General Corps, you have sort of your top-level lawyers. Those are very experienced people who have been in the service usually for decades, and they are general officers, which means they wear a star or sometimes 3 stars on their uniform, and they are assigned to higher levels of command. So basically, the higher-ranking JAG officer you are, the higher level of commander you are advising. So, for example, there's a JAG officer who commands the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There's a JAG officer who may advise what's called a combatant command. A combatant command is a geographical area like Southcom or CENTCOM or AFRICOM. Those are 4-star commands. And so you'd have a pretty high-ranking JAG advising those people. So what Hegseth did when he came in is he sort of started at the top and said, I don't think this number of experienced and well-qualified judge advocates is needed. And he fired them. And moving down the chain, he has taken steps to reassign judge advocates. For example, now there are a number of judge advocates that are becoming immigration judges, which seems totally random. And if you're thinking to yourself, how would a military lawyer know how to be an immigration judge? You are not alone. Many people are asking those same questions. So it is not a very well thought out strategy in terms of how he is dealing with judge advocates, but the result has been the express result has been there's less lawyers and there's less experienced lawyers advising commanders in pretty important positions. And then the sort of implicit result is this message to people in the military that lawyers aren't really important and we can throw them around to any other assignment and the rule of law and following law, that's kind of lower on your priorities. As a soldier, your real priority should be kill, kill, kill. And the military, of all places, is a, pretty aggressive and lethal place to work. And, while I don't sort of disagree with the idea that the United States military should be aggressive, should be lethal, should be a leader in technology and strategy and force allocation, the reason why we are so successful and the reason why we are sort of a feared adversary is because we have very strong alliances and we have respect in the international community because of our commitment to the rule of law. And that goes all the way back to really both world wars. But the comparison that I like to make, and I'll talk a little bit about the Venezuelan boat strikes, and you can tell me to stop ranting whenever you want.
You're here to rant.
Okay. The sort of inflection point that I go back to is right after World War II, the United States and the rest of the world were sort of reeling from the atrocities of World War II, and not just in the European theater, which I think is what we mostly think about. Of course, the concentration camps and the horrific nature of warfare there, but also in the Pacific theater, where you had, really just flagrant violations of human rights and horrific acts committed by human beings on one another, both in the ocean. There's many instances of, for example, the Japanese firing on shipwrecked survivors, which we're right back there, right? And the targeting of medical professionals, for example, when a Marine Corps medic would go to treat downed soldiers on, I'll just use Iwo Jima as an example, the medic would be targeted specifically, even though that person wasn't part of the fight, because that, disrupted the enemy. And so that was a horrific practice. And the international community came to an agreement that this is not how warfare should be fought, and established this treaty, series of treaties, actually, the Geneva Conventions in 1949. And the U.S. signed and ratified that. That is law to the United States, all four Geneva Conventions. Now, there are additional protocols that we have not fully ratified, but for the purposes, if we're going to talk about the Venezuelan strikes, for all purposes, we have signed and ratified the relevant law, and we are bound by it. Mm-hmm. And so what concerns me, what I've been hearing most from lawmakers, from educated, informed lawmakers who their predecessors ratified this into law, ratified Geneva into law, sort of discounting all of the lessons that we learned from these past horrific global experiences and throwing them all away for something that isn't even hostilities, right? We're talking about drug trafficking, is really disturbing. And I should have said at the beginning, I'm just so glad that you invited me here because, as you probably know, a bunch of JAG officers have been all over media trying to correct the record, trying to correct what is the law of armed conflict, what is armed hostilities, because we're losing those definitions. They're just slipping away as we apply labels like terrorism and imminence to things that aren't either of those concepts. So we've been making a really concerted effort to remind the public that this is not normal. You can't just slap the word terrorist on everything and say that they're lethally targetable. But those all occur in like 5 to 7 minute clips, as I'm sure that you know. And so that's why I just appreciate your inviting me on a podcast where you can get into a little bit more detail. Mm-hmm. So the other sort of concerning thing of seeing people forget and try to justify, and I'll use the September 2nd strike as an example, try to justify that, well, these were drug traffickers, who cares? Well, they were terrorists, so we should have blown them out of the water. And I don't care that they're shipwrecked, or I don't care that, they were out of the fight. And we can talk more on that in a few minutes as to whether or not they even knew they were in the fight. Right. But that's concerning because I deployed twice to combat. 2016, I deployed to Iraq. 2017, I deployed to Syria. And in those instances, we had already gone through the 2003 Iraq invasion. We were well into Afghanistan, and a terrorist organization, a true terrorist organization known as the Islamic State, had taken over Iraq. And memories are short, but mine is not, and I hope your listeners are not. You had James Foley sort of gruesomely murdered by the Islamic State. We watched a Jordanian pilot be captured and burned alive by the Islamic State. These are monstrous, monstrous adversaries who had no respect for the armed conflict. They had no interest. They did not submit to any Western understanding of the rule of law or of the rules of engagement or of human rights generally. And even against that adversary, we applied the laws of armed conflict. Mm-hmm. I advised on airstrikes in Baghdad and in Syria. Both of my deployments, I was working in something called a strike cell. And to your point earlier, what do lawyers do in various forms and various units? In that particular capacity, I was advising a commander or a set of commanders in some instances on whether or not we could actually take a strike that we had planned. And so many times we were circling an Islamic State fighter who was clearly dying and clearly out of the fight, but also a member of one of the most horrific terrorist organizations I think that we've seen in this human history. So we didn't take the shot because if they were wounded and out of the fight, we abided by the laws of armed conflict. And indeed, that is what separated the United States and our coalition allies from our enemy. That was the distinction. And if we don't follow the rules of our conflict, if we disregard the lawyers, if we say that we can just engage in warfare lawlessly, we will revert back to the very atrocities that we slipped into. And the United States has plenty of its own history to look back on in this regard, too. We will slip back to that era at our own peril. So that is what distinguishes us. And by the way, our allies think that, too. I can think of very few, actually no, circumstances where the United States went to war alone. And we had a 68-member country coalition in Iraq. And in Syria, it wasn't quite as many, but we still were there with the UK, with the French. We had strong allies with us in both of those countries. And the reason why we had the international support, both logistically and kinetically, right? Like we had actual UK fighter pilots and French air assets on the team with us, right? Engaging in strikes against these targets, but also intelligence-wise. Other countries have sources and methods that they can share with us pursuant to international treaties that help us in our fight. So even if they're not supporting kinetically, as I say, or lethally, they were supporting in other ways. And so that is the approach. It is a very successful approach to entering into an armed conflict. And when we alienate ourselves from our allies like this, and we do so by disregarding the rules of engagement and telling our allies, you know what, French, you might not be okay with shooting somebody who's wounded or shooting somebody who's shipwrecked, but we are. The French are going to say, and I'm using this as a hypothetical, the French or the British or whoever are going to say, wonderful, we don't want any part of that. So you're going to be on this on your own, United States. So strategically, even if you weren't, sort of disturbed by the moral obligation that we have to follow the rules of armed conflict, strategically, it doesn't make sense to disregard them because we're going to lose our allies when we do that. So that was a bit of a rambling question to your note about, keeping lawyers in place and the importance of lawyers, both domestically and on the battlefield. But we have, in my opinion, a secretary in leadership who does not think strategically about this, who just thinks, what can I put on my social media page that's going to get the base sort of riled up? And it is
and make me feel like a bigger, stronger, tougher man.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's a very elementary way of looking at warfare, but then again, we have a Fox News host who is the Secretary of Defense. So
a weekend Fox News.
A weekend.
He wasn't even good enough to go Monday through Friday. It's really important to make that distinction in the context of this conversation.
Yeah. So, like, what do you expect, right? Like, it's sort of like it's degrading. It is disappointing. It is tragic, but also half of the Senate or more than half of the Senate voted for him. So, like, this is what we get. And so if we elected people who approve of this style of leadership, the answer is to get those people out of the Senate and put people in who will actually hold somebody like this accountable, who values our military, who does not want to be a laughingstock, and who actually understands the long-term mission of the United States military and understands the history of the United States military and why we cannot, we've built this sort of reservoir of our reputation and our reliability with our allies. And we are emptying that reservoir very quickly with what we're doing in Venezuela and elsewhere. So in some sense, it's tragic, but it's entirely predictable. I mean, this is a guy who campaigned basically on pardoning war criminals. So no surprise that when he hatches this like harebrained idea to blow up drug mules, the very first strike ends in this catastrophic, like scandalous global embarrassment of a war crime or a supposed war crime. And I can tell you, I think my views on it, that it's not a war crime because we're not actually at war. But for the sake of this discussion, of course, this is exactly how
murder is just as bad in a way.
Yes, precisely. So that and I'm sure you've heard me talk about this before, but like I think if we want to think about the September 2nd strike, and that sort of gets us to this shared understanding of how horrific it is, if we have to do that through talking through a law of armed conflict perspective, fine. But speaking strictly from a legal analysis, we're not in an armed conflict. And it's actually extremely problematic if we look at drug trafficking as an armed conflict. So either way, it's entirely predictable that this would happen with somebody like Hegseth in charge. And say what you want about the utility of going into Venezuela and the risks that will occur and the, if we go into ground operations there, it will end in body bags, and we know where this is going, and we've already done this before, and for some reason we're not learning from our mistakes. But again, even if none of that bothered you, even if you can wave your hand at it all and say, drugs are bad, drugs are terrorists, I believe what the president is saying, and that person's a terrorist now, and so we should use lethal force and invade Venezuela. Just strategically, do you want somebody who's playing checkers, which is Secretary Hegseth, or do you want somebody who can think about that type of operation from an experienced and informed perspective? Or do you want the weekend Fox News host? So that's what, I personally don't think that reasonable minds can differ on the utility of invading Venezuela, but even pretending that they can, do you really want this person in charge of the operations? Look at how the boat strikes have gone. This is completely harebrained.
And look at Signalgate, which I want to ask you about in a minute.
Signalgate.
Yeah. Yes. But I'm so glad you're talking about all this stuff, because there's one thing that I've been troubled by, which I don't really hear anybody on the mainstream news talking about. And it's kind of shocking in a way, but another reason why we don't do this is because we don't want our boats being pirated. We don't want our citizens being killed. And we certainly don't want our soldiers being shot in the water if they fall off a boat off the coast of name your country. And so this lawlessness that's taking place just seems so, with such disregard for American soldiers' lives.
Completely. I mean, this is what you've just articulated is the slippery slope problem. So if we are calling drug trafficking hostilities, where exactly does that definition end?
Right.
Because does it mean that we can just start launching hellfires at pickup trucks coming across the border in Del Rio? Does it mean that a drug mule that, by the way, the Department of Justice wouldn't even have prosecuted? Most likely, they've been trying to deport people who come over the border to up their immigration stats. So if somebody were to cross the border with a truck full of the same amount of cocaine, and by the way, we haven't even mentioned that we're not even talking about fentanyl in the Caribbean. We're just talking about cocaine. But we'll put that aside for the second.
Well, Trump is talking about fentanyl in the Caribbean.
Yes.
But it doesn't exist there.
Yes, we're talking about facts that aren't in play. We talk about nuclear weapons too, but they're not there. So, picture a truck coming over the border in Texas, and it is carrying roughly the same amount of cocaine that's in one of these drug boats. And as soon as it crosses the border, somebody takes the driver out of the seat and puts a gun to his head and shoots him point blank. Mm-hmm. That is the equivalent. If we are calling drug trafficking hostilities, that is the equivalent. Take it a step further. What about the street corner dealer? What about the user? I mean, where does that stop? Mm-hmm. Terrorism, when we have applied, this is what happens when you apply a terrorism framework to something that isn't terrorism. It results in catastrophic consequences. So that's from the perspective that I think complements what you were just saying, which is, what if the U.S. continues down this road of using lethal force against its own citizens that it thinks are members of Tren de Aragua, against its own citizens that are engaging, quote, in armed hostilities by selling fentanyl, the street corner dealer, the user, the pharmacist? Obviously, we would say that you can't use lethal force against those people and that isn't justified. Congress, for trafficking cocaine, Congress hasn't even assigned the capital punishment. So we know Congress wouldn't approve lethal force here, either in an armed conflict or a domestic perspective. But the other piece of it, which you've touched on in your comments just now, is what the international community could do. If we are setting the standard that a country can just deem something like drugs to be an armed hostility worthy of military intervention, then I shudder to think about what our enemies would feel justified in doing, targeting Americans who, I don't know, manufacture firearms that are used in conflicts abroad, or Americans that are participating in the drug trade that they feel harm their citizens, or, and I'll go out on a limb here, but like manufacture pornography or something that a country determines is culturally offensive to them. I understand that there are there's a difference between overdose deaths and sort of a religious ideology that says you can't watch pornography. I get it. But what I'm saying is, if we're just saying anything can be warfare, that is where we go down this slippery slope of saying that anything is legally targetable if the government deems it an affront to its population. And that simply is not the case. You are legally targetable if you are participating in armed hostilities, or if you are about to participate in armed hostilities against the United States. Those facts are not present here.
Well, this is Trump's MO. Domestically, when he wants to do something, he just says there's an emergency, right? Yes. Internationally, what he does is, slap the terrorist label on somebody. But you raised a really good point, and that is we still have Geneva Conventions. We still have the laws of armed conflict. We still have the rules of engagement. We still have the rule of law. Like, in this country, you could arrest someone who's a serial killer for murdering children. They get arrested, they get prosecuted, and if they're found guilty in a court of law, they go to prison. We're in this place in this country right now where the talk is like, it's okay to kill bad guys because they're bad. But that's just not how we do it. It's just not how we do it. And the fact that we're having this conversation, it's insanity to me.
So what we're talking about in the Venezuela vote strikes it's summary executions. These are summary executions of citizens of another country who, the facts as we know it, the undisputed facts as we know it, were shipping non-fentanyl drugs from a country that is not the United States to another country that is not the United States. So while domestically, of course, we have the U.S. Constitution and that doesn't apply to non-citizens abroad, it certainly demonstrates our respect for due process. Mm-hmm. And in place of the Constitution, obviously, it doesn't have, the same protections. But the law of armed conflict and customary international law control in those scenarios. And so when we are conducting summary executions based on labeling somebody a terrorist, the other part of that slippery slope argument is what happens when what happens when we name somebody else a terrorist? What happens when we name a political group a terrorist? Are people just going to continue to believe this? And if we are saying simply labeling somebody a terrorist subjects you to summary execution no matter where you are in the world. I don't think I have to explain to you that the sort of like obvious consequences of that when we call domestic citizens terrorist, which is a term that for some reason we feel we can fly around. One thing that I've been saying to people is if you haven't read 1984, or if you have read it and you should reread it, or you should read it for the first time, because the central theme of that by George Orwell is that the government can control the masses simply by changing definitions of things. It can say, this is the enemy now, and that is the enemy now. And so that is, I don't think I'm being, sort of hyperbolic here by saying that's what's happening with the word terrorist. We're just saying, well, these people are terrorists and those people are terrorists. And so the danger of that, if we are connecting summary executions with terrorism, I think is obvious, and hopefully I don't have to spell that out further. But yeah, I mean, when you look at how we deal with these types of offenses domestically, it certainly informs how we want to represent ourselves as a country internationally.
Yeah. And I think politically, in doing land, as Trump likes to call it, I'm going to do land. If he invades Venezuela, that would probably be a political disaster for him because, A, his base is already upset about the economy. His polling is 31% in terms of his handling of the economy. And what happened to America first? Like they don't want to see us in Venezuela when they can't afford eggs. So I think that's a big backfire if he does that. So I'm not sure he's going to do it, but with these people, you never know.
Yeah, I mean, I it's hard for me to comment on the politics of it all. I don't think any of his, there is no need for consistency. We also have this sort of phenomenon where the ruling party is the party of conspiracy theorists. And I don't know if you're familiar with the law firm that I work for, but we actually tried a case against Alex Jones. And so we secured a very significant jury verdict on behalf of our clients who are the Sandy Hook victims. My firm is based here in Connecticut. So one lesson that we have gleaned from dealing with conspiracy theorists is that facts don't matter to them. It doesn't matter that you're telling, as you were saying, yes, that's not America first. It doesn't matter. There will be basically conspiracy theorists will change reality in order to convert to the worldview, not the other way around. I think a typical person would base their worldview on what they see in reality. The inverse is true with conspiracy theorists. And so when we talk about, a land invasion would not be America first, there will be some justification created by that immovable part of his base, I think, at least.
There will certainly be an attempt to do that. The big question is, will it work this time? Because we're seeing he's been weakened over the last several weeks by lots of things, Epstein, pick your scandal. And his hold on the base to that effect may not be the same as it used to be. So that's why I feel like, as someone who is watching the politics of this, not a bright move for him to do that right now. He's weakened right now.
The overarching justification so far has been to end drug trafficking. And I think you could say that is America first. And invading Venezuela will give us oil reserves, and that is America first. But it's not about drug trafficking and the cost of invading another country in what appears to be a posture where we are alone and unafraid, without allies and without the intelligence support and without the logistical infrastructure that we would need to come away with that with any benefit. I think I hope that is rejected. Every one of these scandals, I hope, is the final red line. And surely I would think that invading another country without congressional authorization, without the support of if it goes without the support of the political base, if people don't bend themselves into pretzels trying to justify it, I hope that that's the final red line, because American lives are the cost of it.
In our last couple of minutes, talk to me about Signalgate and what the biggest concerns are there, because that's like a whole other, Hegseth should have been gone over that, but somehow he's still around.
I know. Oh, Signalgate. I mean, that seems like centuries ago, right? Like, it is. First of all, can I just say, when that happened, I didn't even know that it was that, of all the insane things that could happen, because that was the Eric Adams case was going on, the law firms were being targeted. It was hard to even focus on what chaos was being unleashed each day. But I remember thinking like, man, I didn't even know that was a possibility. And so now every day when I open up Signal, like I hope somebody invites me to one of his chat groups. Like I didn't even know that could happen. That's so.
Maybe you'll be on the doing land thing.
Yes, maybe they'll invite me. Maybe somebody will like accidentally add me. So now I've been hoping that every day that I accidentally get invited to a Pete Hegseth chat.
The odds are better at it happening than not, probably.
Yes, I know. So he's definitely, I mean, I would assume he's still using it. I guess and further investigation and other strikes will reveal that. But no, look, there's two things that I'll say about it. One is that sharing airstrikes on Signal like it's some cool social media post with your buddies is exactly the type of person who does that. The type of person who does that should not be in charge of airstrikes. Mm-hmm. It is not something cool to share with your friends. It puts American fighter pilots in extreme danger by flashing their location and the types of munitions that they're using, and the time that they're going to be over target. Whatever else could be gleaned, even if it wasn't expressly in that information, that is extremely dangerous to service members. But of course, again, we have somebody with no experience or wherewithal to understand that, and appears to be totally indignant to that. And two, this is just another example of the total disregard for intelligence standards and for the gravity of the job that he has. So we have seen people who should not have security clearances get security clearances. We have seen, serious, I think, compromises made in order to put people into leadership positions. And so the idea that the Secretary of Defense could just so callously, and sort of without any thought at all, do this type of thing, it makes you wonder about the chats where the editor of The Atlantic wasn't invited. Like, how many of those chats are out there? Because that's the only reason we learned about this one.
Yep.
So this is, it's all just sort of another piece of the pie of somebody who is largely unqualified, which is, again, like the real irony of all of this is that Pete Hegseth, if he has no other tagline, it's that you shouldn't lower standards. Don't lower them for women. Don't lower them for people getting into the military for age or weight or anything. Everybody should adhere to the same standards, except for Pete Hegseth.
Except for the man in charge.
Pete Hegseth, you can lower all the standards. You can look away from the signal gate. You can disregard the idea that he has no clue what he's doing in a military theater. Lower all those standards for him. But all of you service members, we're going to hold the standard for you. So that's the true irony, I think, of Signal Gate and its outcome.
Yeah. I think all anyone ever needs to know about Pete Hegseth is to just watch Colin Jost's brilliant take on him on SNL, because it is so spot on. And it's one of my favorite characters now. Margaret, thanks so much for coming on. I hope you'll come back and chat with us again.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
All righty. Take care. This episode was produced and edited by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-produced by Matty Rosenberg and Jen Hammoud for Radio Free Rhiniecliff, with additional editing by Matty Rosenberg, music by Andrew Hollander, and graphic design by Cricket Lengyel. And with a special thanks to our sponsor, The Epicurean. Again, thanks for listening. Please rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to the Backroom with Andy Ostroy YouTube channel, where you can watch full videos of our interviews. See you next time.